Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Penn. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner and co-founder of Open Nurses. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome Steve Levine. Dr. Steve Levine is a board-certified psychiatrist who spent his career working across multiple facets of the healthcare system to improve people's lives through creating access to innovation. Steve completed internship and residency in psychiatry at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medical Center, and then completed fellowship subspecialty training in psychosomatic medicine and psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York Presbyterian Hospital. Prior to Compass Pathways, he led the company he founded in 2010, Actify Neurotherapies, that built new models of care delivery across the US for interventional psychiatry treatments. He's published extensively in both peer-reviewed journals and popular media, presented to both professional and lay audiences around the world, served in leadership roles for professional societies and not-for-profit entities, and received numerous awards for leadership and service. Compass Pathways, where he is the chief patient officer, is a biotechnology company dedicated to accelerating patient access to evidence-based innovation in mental health. Their first major initiative is developing investigational COMP360 psilocybin treatment through a global phase 3 program for people living with treatment-resistant depression. So let me invite Steve onto the stage. Hey, Steve, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Andrew, it's a pleasure to be here and really nice to see you.
Fantastic. Well, would love to start off just before we dive into what Compass is doing and what's happening in the psychedelic space, which there's certainly been a lot in the last week with the executive order coming out of the White House and a lot of things coming up, coming out of phase 3 trials. Would love to hear, we always ask people, how'd you get here? Because psychedelics always has such an interesting path.
There's a movie I really like. It's a little bit obscure. It's called The Extra Man. It's a film adaptation of a book by Jonathan Ames. And one of the main characters throughout the movie is a running gag. He will show up in a scene and say, well, here we are. Where are we? And I relate to that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm exactly where I always thought I would be. Although when I trace it back, it does make sense. And so, it's a long story as I get older, but the short version of it is that, as you said in my bio, I'm a psychiatrist by training, but, maybe then different than what people typically think of as a psychiatrist, especially these days, which sadly is typically somebody who has a short appointment with you and is writing you a prescription. My training was very psychotherapy focused. Mm-hmm. And that really has been an emphasis for me in terms of more holistic care of people over time. That, I don't know, it feels insulting to me to think of people as just a bag of chemicals and you sprinkle in some medicine and that should be the answer. Yeah. And so I've always, across my, various activities I've done in my career, tried to think about care delivery in that way. What is the intersection of biological treatment and talking cures? And I guess the major branch point in my career was in 2010, where, truly making a very long story very short, but we can go into detail, I became interested in some of the early academic studies looking at the repurposing of ketamine, an old anesthetic, for psychiatric indications. That led me to start the first network of ketamine clinics in the US, for better and for worse at this point, given some of the Wild West off the rails stuff that's happened since then. Mm-hmm. And that really gave me the opportunity to get exposed to a number of different areas of science, from drug development to the exploration at the more basic science level of novel mechanisms in psychiatric conditions, to considerations of building models of care delivery and how do treatments actually get to patients in a broad and equitable way. Because it's all well and good if there's a new option, but if it can't get to the people who need it, then what have you accomplished? Yeah. And so, some of the salient stops along the way were when S-ketamine, J&J's FDA-approved version of ketamine, was approved in 2019, it was an opportunity for me to shift my practice Actify from a focus on off-label, non-insurance covered ketamine to a focus on FDA-approved and insurance-covered treatments in the name of patient access. Mm-hmm. It also gave me a front row seat to how difficult it can be to truly create patient access? How do you commercialize such a new paradigm of care in psychiatry? And there were some hard lessons learned there, from me on the provider side, but also on the industry side.
Yeah.
In 2020, sadly, in a confluence of circumstances that include being impacted by the initial commercial challenges of Spravato, but also with the pandemic and some other factors, wound up closing my company, which was awful. But in retrospect, the silver lining was it gave me an opportunity to join Compass Pathways. Co-founders, I was by the early research looking at using their formulation, COMP360, formulation of psilocybin, a psychedelic compound for treatment-resistant depression, which is a major depressive disorder when somebody has been failed by at least 2 treatments in their current episode. But having a sense that if J&J, with the might of J&J behind them, struggled to commercialize Spravato, if we didn't start thinking early about various aspects of patient access to psychedelic treatments, then, as promising as the science is, we would risk never reaching the patients who are waiting.
Yeah, yeah. And it was around that time too, because, we were saying before we came on camera that I think I met you in the early days of sort of ketamine. Raquel Bennett, a mutual colleague, who used to do these ketamine conferences here in the Bay Area back when ketamine was kind of an obscure thing.
Yeah.
Right. And in those early, it's interesting because ketamine initially wasn't really seen in the sort of family of psychedelic therapies. There's always this sort of question around mechanism of action and if it's truly a psychedelic, which isn't really worth getting into here. But at that time, the paradigm was really infusion. The data that came out of Yale was from infusions, and then it was somewhere. It feels like it was somewhere around the mid 20 teens where we started talking about sort of ketamine assisted therapy and the idea that you might use ketamine in the same way that, say, MAPS was using MDMA. But that's interesting. That's how you ended up with Compass. And so for people that are less familiar with Compass, because we have a lot of folks in our audience who are kind of interested in the field sort of broadly, but aren't necessarily drug nerds or pharma nerds like I am. And so, could you tell us what Compass has been working on for what now a good close to over a decade now, right?
About a decade. Yeah, founded in 2016.
Yeah. And so what is the primary focus of Compass?
So Compass is a biotechnology company, a biotech, which means that we primarily focus on research and development of new potential treatments, in our case, for mental health conditions. And specifically, we've been studying a compound that we call COMP360, which is a proprietary synthetic formulation of psilocybin. So synthetic, no mushrooms are harmed in the course of our research.
You're not grinding up mushrooms and trying to stuff them into little gelatin capsules? Okay.
No, sir. Yeah. So we've been studying this in increasingly, large and robust trials. In fact, the largest and most robustly designed studies of a classical psychedelic to date. In, as I mentioned before, treatment-resistant depression, people living with major depression who haven't benefited from first-line treatment options. That's our most advanced program. We also have a program in PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, for which we are right now standing up a late-stage study.
Okay. And so for people that are learning about how these clinical trials work, so we throw these terms around phase 2, phase 3. So you guys are now, so phase 3 is the last thing that comes before going to the FDA and saying, we have this data, we'd like you to review. And if you agree with it, then you get approval of that drug. Is that a reasonable synopsis?
That's a reasonable synopsis. The FDA, in their mandate to protect the public health, is making a determination of risk versus benefit for an application for a new product or device in a specific population. right? So we're not looking for an approval of COMP360 for just anyone to take for any reason.
Right.
We're studying it specifically in people living with this one condition, treatment-resistant depression. And in order for them to make that risk-benefit determination, they need to understand the population and the risks they face without having new options to treat their condition.
Mm-hmm.
And then they need to see evidence of safety in these studies, as well as efficacy. Does the drug work?
Right, and they're really looking for the balance between those two things. And so one of the things that seemed to create a lot of confusion around the 2024 time of the Lykos application was this kind of conflation between FDA approval and, say, drug legalization. So often people would think, I would hear, oh, MDMA is going to be legal if this is approved by the FDA. And so could you shed some light on that, about how the sort of nuance of that? Because obviously the drug has to be rescheduled in order for it to come off of Schedule 1. But could you talk a little more about that?
Yes. And in order to answer it, maybe helpful to start with kind of the third pillar that FDA evaluates. I mentioned safety and efficacy. They're also evaluating the quality of the product.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a purified form? Is it standardized? Is it stable? Is it reproducible, et cetera? Or is it manufactured in a facility that passes certain quality testing and checks, right? And so to answer your question about this difference between legalization of a currently illegal substance versus what it means if something's FDA approved, yes, I mean, first of all, whether it's MDMA or any of the classical psychedelics like our form of psilocybin COMP360 or other forms of psilocybin or LSD, these are all currently considered Schedule 1, meaning the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, has determined that there's some risk of abuse or misuse or divergence, and importantly, there's no approved medical use.
Right.
If any of these compounds are FDA approved, then they no longer meet that criterion of no approved medical use, which means they need to be rescheduled by the DEA, downscheduled to still a controlled substance status, but one where it can be prescribed under certain conditions by licensed prescribers. When they make that approval and rescheduling determination, it is specifically for the compound being studied.
Mm.
So just because COMP360 may get an FDA approval and be rescheduled, it doesn't then mean that all psilocybin products are rescheduled, because those haven't been evaluated for that quality standard.
Right.
And it also doesn't mean that just the compound more broadly is legal, where it would be available even without a prescription.
Okay.
So it becomes legal for prescription for a specified population under certain conditions.
That's super helpful. And totally appreciating you not being an attorney, being willing to dive into the legal aspects of this. And so it sounds like there might be, I think, what's known as bifurcated scheduling, so that in the same way that cannabis weirdly is still a Schedule 1 drug, well, this may be the last week that it is. There's rumor that it's going to be rescheduled to Schedule 3 next week, but at this moment in time, it's still a Schedule 1 drug. But a drug like Epidiolex or Marinol is a Schedule 3 or 4 drug, I think. So your COMP360 compound would be rescheduled, but psilocybin, at least on the Controlled Substance Act, would still remain a Schedule 1 drug. Correct.
And actually, Epidiolex is a great analog, because that is a cannabis-derived product. It's a CBD.
CBD, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And at the time, before its FDA approval, it was also a Schedule 1 substance that needed to be rescheduled. But when it was approved and rescheduled, right, it was just specifically Epidiolex that was rescheduled.
Okay, got it. All right. And so, just to kind of put us in time, your company announced one of those top line readouts, which is before it gets published in a journal, of your latest phase 3 data in treatment-resistant depression, just maybe 2 months ago now. So can you give us a sneak peek at what you found?
Yes, very exciting what we found. In this group of people who find it very difficult to find effective treatment and treatment that's tolerable, and in the same population where there are currently 50 plus approved antidepressants, many of which have tried to show that they're effective in this group of people with treatment-resistant depression and failed to do so.
Yeah.
What we saw was that a subset of patients had benefit as of the first day following a single administration. And for those who had a clinically meaningful benefit, with 1 or 2 treatments, that could be sustained out to at least 6 months, which is the furthest time point we've measured to date.
Wow.
So that is a rapidity of effect and durability of effect, unlike anything we've ever seen for people living with depression.
Yeah.
And we saw that in a way that's known as statistically significant. And it was statistically significant at every measured time point, starting at that day following the administration out to our primary endpoint, which is how the study is designed. You want to specify, what is the time point when you say this treatment worked? And for us, that was 6 weeks after the administration.
Mm-hmm.
Statistically significant means the result is very unlikely to have been due to chance.
Right. Yeah. So it's both statistically significant, meaning it's not a fluke, and it's clinically significant in that it was a significant enough drop to be considered. I think it's important for people to understand. I know you know this, Steve, but that these things are not compared against existing drugs. So when you do this, you're going up against a placebo usually. And in these trials, how did you measure the outcome? What were you comparing it against?
This is something that's been the subject of a lot of discussion because you're right. Typically, the comparator in these studies is placebo. It's an inert drug. It's something that's not supposed to have any active therapeutic properties. And that allows you to not only compare the true effectiveness, the efficacy of your treatment, by subtracting out anything that may be due to the placebo effect, which is, the non-specific effects of a treatment, but also have a true safety baseline. Because if there are adverse events that are drug-related, you know that it's related to the drug and not to some other active component of what you're comparing it to. The problem here is, or at least what's been treated as something different and special about psychedelics, is because there is an acute experience, the psychedelic effect, which is very different than people's daily living experience. There is a psychedelic trip, if you will.
You kind of know what group you were assigned to.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious if you got a psychedelic drug or nothing. Now, there are some ways to control for that. First of all, if you've never had a psychedelic experience before, that might make it a little bit harder to tell because you don't really know what to expect.
Right.
And so we did limit the percentage of people entering our studies who could have had prior experience. We capped it at 15% in phase 3. We actually had between 5 and 7% across our treatment arms.
Okay.
But still, even with that, it is obvious. It's what's known as unblinding. You can't maintain a blinded study if you can tell which arm you've been assigned to. This isn't unique to psychedelics, by the way. Really with any psychiatric drug that you're studying, like, antidepressants like SSRIs or antipsychotic drugs or anti-anxiety medicines, those are unblinding too. You can feel the difference between that and placebo. But
if you suddenly have a dry mouth that you didn't have last week, you often guess, well, I think I know which arm I was assigned to.
Exactly. So, in special attention has been paid to this with psychedelics because there is such a dramatic experience. And so the study design we used initially in phase 2 and then brought into phase 3 as well, and this is a design pioneered by our chief medical officer, Guy Goodwin, is to compare multiple active doses, a low, a medium, and a high dose. So what we did is we ran 2 separate trials. One of them was our 25 milligram dose versus a true placebo.
Okay.
The FDA was interested in a design like that primarily so we could establish that true safety baseline. The second study, though, is that 3-arm design where we looked at 1 milligram, 10 milligrams, and 25 milligrams of psilocybin. Now there, when you otherwise have blinded conditions in the trial, and most people have never had this experience before, and you tell them ahead of time, truthfully, you will receive some dose of psilocybin. And they have this very immersive experience because on the day they're there for 6 to 8 hours, they're wearing an eye shade, they're listening to a playlist of music, they're lying down in a nice room. All of a sudden, it's much more confusing what you got. And particularly between the 10 milligram and the 25 milligram groups, there's a lot of overlap in that experience and a lot of confusion. And so with that, we have been able to show what's called a dose response, where you can see an escalating level of benefit as you get up to the higher doses, which really is a good proof point that what we are seeing is a true drug effect.
So people that get the 10 milligram dose, and I've as you know, I've done dosings with people in the lab I work in, and people feel 10 milligrams. So people always ask me, like, what's the equivalent of that in dried mushrooms? And it depends on the species of mushroom and whatnot, but it's probably somewhere around a gram of dried mushrooms. So people feel something, and if you've never had psilocybin before, you don't know if this is a big or a small thing or what, right? So what you're saying is that, so they got 10 or they got 25, which is, maybe closer to 3 grams. But that the people that got the higher dose got more better than the people that got the lower 2 doses.
Correct.
But that both, at least the 10 and the 25 milligram people had some effect. So you could see that more in that case was better.
Yeah, it was interesting. In phase 2, we gave the treatment only one time. And in that study, the 25 milligram group versus the 1 milligram group worked quite well. The 10 milligram arm, there was some separation from the 1 milligram early on, but by the primary endpoint at week 3, there was 0 separation. It fell flat. 10 milligrams did not work. In phase 3, our more recent studies, we used 10 milligrams just in that second study I mentioned with the 3 arms. But this time we gave 2 administrations, 3 weeks apart. Everybody got this twice, once on day 1, and then again 3 weeks later. In that study, there was a statistically significant separation of the 10 milligram group from the 1 milligram. However, the degree of benefit was not clinically meaningful in 10 milligrams, but was with 25.
Okay.
So we still do think of 25 as the active dose that we will be discussing with the FDA for approval.
And so, obviously you can't predict what the FDA approval or label would say, but is the assumption that it would probably be a one size fits all dose of 25 milligrams, that there wouldn't be a 10 milligram option? It wouldn't come in that form.
Right. The typical standard for the approval of a drug in psychiatry is 2 positive trials. So in the case of 25 milligrams, if you include phase 2, we've now had 3 positive studies in 25 milligrams. For 10 milligrams, 1 was positive, 1 was negative. So it really doesn't meet that evidence standard for an approval of that dose.
So you can feel more confident in that 25 milligram dose being not only an effective dose, but a more durable efficacy. Because that's another big question here, right? I mean, you're taking a whole day, you're possibly going through a big experience, which might be both enjoyable and difficult, maybe both at the same time. So you want to get some mileage out of that, right? So if you're only better for a couple of days, the FDA would probably say, well, that's interesting, but probably not worth approving. But if you can say this lasts for some amount of time, because it seems like, the early days of this, I'm sure you very well remember this, even just 7-8 years ago. I mean, I remember seeing headlines in the New York Times saying 1 dose of a magic mushroom and his depression was gone for life, right? And we even flirted with the word cure in psychiatry, which we don't normally do, right? And so it appears now that these treatments, like all treatments, have a durability. They have a certain amount of time that they're going to last for, and then what? Do people need to be redosed, or how do you imagine that in the future if somebody gets better for, say, 6 months, but then they start to fall back into depression? Do we imagine that they'll be able to be redosed, or will that be all? Is it going to be one and done?
We're going to have some additional data in early Q3, which is the data out to 6 months in the second study. That's going to be really helpful to give us more information about understanding the so-called profile of the drug. What would we expect the dosing schedule to be? Ahead of that, just speculating based upon what we know so far, And of course, this will be subject to discussion with the FDA, and ultimately we'll have to agree upon what a label should look like. But the label is the instructions for how the product should be used. But I think it's likely to say something like 1 or 2 initial administrations, because that's how we've studied this. In one study, just 1 initial, and the other was 2. And for some people, we do see some additional benefit of that second dose 3 weeks later. So 1 or 2 initial administrations, and then some language related to retreatment, where ultimately I think we would expect on average people to have maybe 2 to 4 treatments in a year.
Okay. So
now, I compare that to, sorry, go ahead.
Episodic treatment. So you're doing this maybe quarterly or twice a year, something like that. Yeah.
Or something like that. And one of the reasons why this is such a big deal is because if you compare that to the only available pharmaceutical product being prescribed to people with treatment-resistant depression today on label, that would be esketamine, Spravato. And the dosing schedule for that is twice per week in the first month, so 8 times in the first month, and then weekly in the second month. And then maintenance is either weekly or every other week. The majority of people wind up continuing weekly. And so that translates into 25 to 50 potential treatments, 2 to 3 hour treatments in a year. That not only affects a patient and their life and their schedule, their ability to work, et cetera, but also a caregiver who needs to drive them to every one of their appointments. Versus this emerging profile for COMP360, where we're seeing effect for some people the next day, and potentially durable treatment of 6 months or more, potentially for just 1 or 2 administrations.
Yeah. And you alluded to something there that I think is also worth pointing out, that so there's the FDA label, which is sort of what the drug is, can be used for, what's known about the drug, safety, et cetera. And things like drug-drug interactions as well would also be listed in a label. But then there's the REMS. So when you mentioned, you can't drive that day with esketamine, can you talk about what the REMS is as it relates to the label and what that might look like if I was a patient coming in to get COMP360?
REMS is one of the million acronyms we use in drug development, and it stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. And what this essentially means is that for new products that have some potential adverse events of interest, or maybe as a first example of a new class of drug, for a variety of reasons why the FDA may be interested in following patients over a long period of time, as a new drug moves from clinical trials to post-approval into larger populations in the real world, they will require a program called a REMS, which has certain goals, and these are identified potential risks of interest that will be followed in some way over a longer period of time. It's like a form of a registry. And it's the responsibility of the manufacturer to set this up and administer it and follow patients and report data out. And so we fully anticipate that COMP360, if approved, will have a REMS. And that will mean that the clinicians and the sites of care that will deliver this treatment, that will prescribe it and take care of patients while they're having this treatment, will need to be certified. And that certification usually is, some amount of education, reviewing information related to the product, understanding the prescribing information, setting up policies and procedures within that site of care to safely deliver the product compliantly, et cetera. And then enrolling patients into the REMS. So it's essentially a form of informed consent, and allowing for this tracking of their outcomes over time. And then some form of monitoring. And so probably the best analogy, and I keep picking on esketamine, but it is the closest analog in psychiatry right now. Patients are enrolled in that, and then every time they have an appointment, a monitoring form is filled out, and it's capturing information like vital signs, blood pressure, heart rate, blood oxygenation. It's asking questions about whether people experience sedation or dissociation, which is a common effect with ketamine products,
Mm-hmm.
and whether people experience those, and when, if they did, when they resolved, et cetera. And so it creates a set of conditions for the safe use of the product.
Okay.
Again, we expect this for COMP360. In many ways, we welcome this because,
Mm-hmm.
we do, acknowledge that this will be a completely new paradigm of care if we have an approved product, and there will be unanswered questions. And, we do want to make sure that there are good, safe outcomes, not only in our studies, but in real world use. And this is, a way of having a little bit more control over the safe use of the product.
Yeah. And we have a lot of nurses in our audience who work in Spravato clinics, and so are familiar with the REMS, probably more on the kind of rules of administration. So for example, like you alluded to, that you can't drive on the day of your esketamine treatment, so you got to have somebody pick you up. This is also why you can't take your Spravato home, right? And that you have to have your blood pressure monitored at 40 minutes and all the things that are part of that REMS. One of the big questions that has sort of come up with psychedelics more in recent years. Now, so you kind of hinted at this when you said that there would be a certain amount of training involved. Certainly there's a whole industry around psychedelic therapist training, if you will. And one of the things that I think I've noticed more in just the last few years as sort of psychedelics have moved out of this sort of university investigator-initiated studies and more into industry has been this change in how we talk about what happens during the session. Do we call that support? Do we call that monitoring? Do we call that therapy? Do we call that psychotherapy? Do we call it psychological support? It seems like there's a sort of panoply of names that people refer to it as. Could you talk about how Compass looks at that? And, this question of, is this, because one of the narratives that we had for years was that this was kind of psychotherapy that was amplified by a drug. And increasingly what it's seeming like is we're looking at, the question is like, what are the drug effects, in terms of both their risk and their salutary effects on that target disease? So could you talk about how Compass is approaching that question?
I think it touches on the concept that language matters, because, I think there's a certain connotation to commonly used language of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or psychedelic assisted therapy that implies that there is the co-occurrence of a psychedelic drug and psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
I think the opportunity to misunderstand or misconstrue that was probably amplified by public awareness, lay awareness of the Lykos development of MDMA, also known as ecstasy, for post-traumatic stress disorder, because MDMA is not a psychedelic. It's sometimes referred to as an empathogen or an entactogen. The distinction is important just because the experience of that is quite different. With MDMA, with an empathogen, there is an opening. It's an experience that in many ways can facilitate a dialogue with someone. It allows for a lowering of defenses and barriers to be able to engage in difficult therapeutic work. And so appropriately matching that, their development program explicitly paired MDMA with psychotherapy. And the theory behind that was that the drug was catalyzing a process of therapy. But that is very different than the experience of a classical psychedelic, which tends to be a quieter, inward-directed experience, where a therapist trying to engage you in a psychotherapeutic process during would not only, you're snickering appropriately because it would not only be very difficult, but probably unwelcome, and maybe even counter-therapeutic, right? If, because, we see some, real-time, imaging of the brain, called functional MRI, that indicates that some of the acute brain changes that are thought to be associated with the therapeutic effects that we see, that those don't occur when somebody is being distracted by a task, which might be the same thing as being distracted by a conversation with someone. So instead, both hewing to the subjective experience of the drug and its potential mechanism, as well as the reality that FDA is evaluating the profile of the drug, and their mandate is not the evaluation of psychotherapy.
Right.
Trials of psychedelics have, as much as possible, tried to eliminate anything that could be confounding of the evaluation of the drug, while also making sure that the support during the administration is appropriate for the compound being studied.
Mm-hmm.
Very long-winded way of saying that the way we've conducted our studies at Compass with COMP360 has been to take some time ahead of the administration day to prepare people. And by prepare, I mean provide treatment education. As I said before, most of the participants in our study have not had previous experience with psychedelics, informed consent, to set certain expectations for what may happen in the study, and to really, teach certain core principles of psychedelic support, being trust and psychological safety. It's important that people are in a mindset where they feel safe, they feel comfortable, they know that they'll be taken care of, and they're ready for the experience. As well as essentially teaching them to be COMP360 patients, in the sense of, because this is an interdirected experience, we want to equip them with the tools they'll need on the day to autonomously self-navigate this interdirected experience, and to be able to maintain what we call present moment focus, to stay attuned to the experience they're having rather than avoiding it, especially if it should make them anxious.
Yeah.
And so in that preparation, they are taught some of these basic skills, they practice them with the support person, and they also set an intention for that administration day, but are also encouraged to recognize that, the experience will be what it will be, and they should be open to whatever emerges.
Okay.
On the administration day, the role of the monitor is primarily passive. It's to be a safe, supportive presence, to allow this person who is lying down and wearing an eye shade and listening to music to self-navigate it. And should they need some assistance, if they become anxious, if they're having a challenging experience, to remind them of what they had practiced during preparation, to help them return to this self-directed, inner-focused experience.
Yeah.
And then on the day following and a week after that, we have the participant meet with the team again. And that's an opportunity for them to be able to talk about what they experienced, with a focus on, some of the more salient points. Also to do some safety checks, have those acute psychedelic experiences fully resolved. Is there any, acute safety concerns like suicidality? Are people at risk of making any kind of impulsive decision or life change on the heels of what may have been a very meaningful experience? Now, all this said, sometimes people hear this and, number one, say, well, that sounds like therapy to me. Or two, why are you trying to take the therapy out of this?
Okay. So you get it from both sides.
Get it from both sides, right? On the first point is probably the more nuanced. So I'll start with the easier one on the second part. No, we're not anti-therapy. As I said in the beginning, I identify primarily as a therapist, even though I'm a psychiatrist. People intuitively assume that adding psychotherapy to a psychedelic will enhance the outcomes in some way. That may be true. We don't really know. We don't really have a lot of data there. It's a big opportunity to study that and to understand it. Again, intuitively, it makes sense, right? If we are reopening what are called critical learning periods because of the enhanced plasticity after having exposure to a substance like this, then that form of new learning may be very beneficial. We just don't have the data to support it. It's also not a part of the FDA approval process. And so in some ways, this is step one, step two, and beyond. We are focused on trying to create new options for the millions of people who are underserved today. FDA approval is really the key that unlocks access, because that's how insurers, payers also
Yeah.
decided to cover something and make this affordable and accessible for people.
All right.
We've got to do that first. And then again, there will still be unanswered questions that will be very interesting to explore.
Yeah, when you're talking about the psychotherapy aspect, it's worth remembering, and that of course, I have heard that many millions of people have had their own personal psychedelic experiences, not in a clinical trial, not with a therapist. And I've worked on studies of survey data that many people report those as being very meaningful to them. And so to know that to be in a setting where you're safe, that you're supported, even if you're not doing active psychotherapy, doesn't mean that experience couldn't be beneficial, is what I think I'm hearing you say. A lot of what you were describing there, as it came to me, and this is maybe a good pivot to this next question I want to ask you, and I also want to remind our audience that they can put questions into the chat, and we'll spend some time at the tail end of our time together going over those. But that sounded a lot like midwifery, that really, like, a good midwife is there, they're present, they're able to handle any kind of emergency if it comes up, but they're not doing a C-section, right? They're not doing that level of invasive intervention. The assumption is that you can get through this, and we're here to make sure you get through it safely. We've done this a whole bunch of times. This is what it's going to look like. That's your informed consent, right? And then afterwards, how was that for you? And it really, this is one of the raison d'etres of this organization, was that, hey, nurses would be really good at this, because a lot of what we're describing in psychedelic assisted therapy actually isn't this sort of more perhaps manualized kind of psychotherapy where, there really is a particular procedure to follow. It's really much more about letting this experience unfold and supporting people in that. So could you talk, I know Compass has really shown some leadership in the integration of nurses into this sort of treatment process. So could you share with the people listening to this what you guys are doing or have done, and what you plan on doing in the future?
Yes. First, I can think of at least two, probably many more, but at least two really good reasons why nurses are extremely well suited to potentially, be a part of people receiving psychedelic treatments. The first, and you were speaking to this, or at least alluding to this a moment ago, I think it's important that people involved in delivering this treatment are temperamentally suited for this work, in the sense of, maybe one of the most important things to be able to convey, either verbally or non-verbally, just by presence, is an ability to not just do something, but stand there, and to convey the sense of, I've got you. I can handle this. Whatever comes up, it's okay. You are safe here. You're safe with me. I can handle it, and I'm going to be here for you. And nurses do that really well. I'm stereotyping, but it's a good stereotype.
Yes, we'll take it.
It certainly has been my experience anyway. Yeah. And then a second thing is, and you're a perfect example of this. It's always tickled me over the years that you can, kind of like tree rings, you can tell where a nurse is in their career by how many initials they have after their name.
We're a profession that suffers from sort of a chronic inadequacy problem, so we make up for it with acronyms after our names.
No, that's the self-deprecating take, and I certainly am a fan of self-deprecating humor. But my interpretation of it is not that. It's that there is a culture of learning.
There is, absolutely.
Of humility, that I don't know everything. I don't come out fully formed. And having a commitment over the course of one's career to continuing to learn new things, to continuing to grow one's career, to move into new areas of specialization, et cetera. It's really quite admirable. And I think it's really salient here, because the reality is that the people, or the credentials of the people who will likely be involved in delivering psychedelic treatments, if FDA approved, are various. It's going to be multidisciplinary care teams. But across the different credentials of healthcare providers, with few exceptions, there are starting to be some exceptions, just in the past couple of years, but with few exceptions, have they had psychedelic education and training as part of receiving their initial degree? Right.
Yeah.
There's now the university psychedelic education program, which is
Mm-hmm.
amazing, which is starting to embed this within curricula,
Mm-hmm.
but that's very new. And of course, within a limited number of universities at this point, hopefully to grow. But again, by and large, this is not part of the education and training that most healthcare providers have, which means they're going to need to learn something new.
Mm-hmm.
And not every healthcare provider, physicians are often guilty of this, are really open to the idea that I don't know something and I'm going to need somebody to teach this to me.
That's right.
But nurses sure are. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I think that that's an exciting thing. And so to answer your question more directly, though, about how we've started incorporating nurses as part of our support teams within our trials, including our upcoming PTSD study that's just getting underway,
Mm-hmm.
is to think about primary and assisting support people,
Mm-hmm.
and the recognition that because there is no psychotherapy happening during administration, we should maybe thinking about licensed healthcare providers who are by their training and temperament best suited to this, rather than kind of, in a way, just teaching therapists to not be therapists.
Mm.
Because that winds up being a lot of the training. You're a therapist, you're licensed to do that. Please forget everything you know while you're in the session, because we want you to do something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So really excited that we are now including nurses as part of the support teams in our study. I look forward to seeing the data from those trials, which I think is going to bear out the value of including nurses in these teams.
So do you imagine that will the expectation be that there will be 2 clinicians in the room for these treatments?
No. So if you look at the designs of our phase 3 studies, as long as there was a closed circuit TV camera in the room, there just
Mm-hmm.
needed to be one person in the room with the participant.
Okay.
The model of having 2 therapists in the room really is primarily an artifact of the Lykos MAPS MDMA for PTSD model, where there's this therapeutic dyad, again, largely reflective of the psychotherapy that's happening in this very
Mm-hmm.
active session with an empathogen, et cetera. So no, we've had just one support person in the room. And I think that's going to be really important as we think about how this translates into real world care delivery, where if there's an overly burdened treatment delivery model that's too expensive to deliver, this isn't going to be affordable, and it's never going to get to the patients that are waiting. So it's important that we're generating this data that demonstrates the safety of using this model. And ultimately, I think what's most important is that there's a prescriber available,
Mm-hmm.
that there is a licensed healthcare provider with mental health experience on site, and the person that's primarily monitoring the person having the experience is, primarily in a passive monitoring, just
Mm-hmm.
providing a safe environment role.
And so in that regard, it's not dissimilar from how Spravato is delivered in a lot of clinics, where it may not even be a licensed therapist, maybe a technician, but the REMS requires a licensed clinician to be on site in case of an emergency or crisis.
Right. The important thing is that in the small percentage of cases where somebody is having a more difficult time,
Mm-hmm.
there's the appropriate person there to immediately be able to intervene.
Yeah.
And so, to your point about it matching the staffing models for sites that deliver Spravato today, yes, those tend to operate as multidisciplinary team-based models of care,
Mm-hmm.
where people are acting within their licensure and their scope of practice and to the top of their license, collaboratively, cooperatively, to take care of the patients having treatment in the center.
Because a lot of times when people hear that I do psychedelic therapy sessions or psychedelic treatment sessions, I think they imagine something a lot sexier than it actually is. It's like, what's that like? It's like, well, it's kind of like watching somebody sleep sometimes. They got the eye shades on, they're tucked into the blankets. You've got, your Brian Eno on in the background, and there's not much happening in that moment. There's a lot happening internally for them, but there's not a lot that you really see. And there's certainly, I was smiling when you were talking about the doing therapy, because I actually had a colleague ask me, like, do you do like CBT during the session? And I was just imagining what a nightmare that would be. What automatic thought are you having right now? Well, the walls are melting. That's probably not what you have in mind. So
or the automatic thought of, please stop talking and leave me alone.
Well, yeah, that's right. And I literally have had, because, depending on the study, these often have these sort of check-in protocols where, we're, one study I'm working on, every 2 hours we have to pop an EEG cap onto somebody. And, we've had people just sort of almost like hold up a hand, like, no, just hold it just give me 1 minute, like, I just need this moment. And I get that. And so there's a lot of, don't just do something, stand there, right? You mentioned primary and secondary monitors, and I just wanted to understand that better. Were you referring to the studies that you're doing, or so there was a distinction between primary and secondary, and I'm not sure I understood it. If you could just clarify that, especially with regards to nursing.
Yeah. So, I was referring to our studies. I did say primary and secondary. I should have said primary and assisting. But yes, excuse me, specifically in the context of our trials.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, where in terms of the roles, it's the primary support person who is conducting the bulk of the preparatory work and the follow-up sessions.
Mm-hmm.
That primary person is available on the day of administration, but it's the assisting support person who's actually in the room with them. And so that's where it mirrors what we would expect to translate into real world care delivery, where it's the higher credentialed licensed mental health care provider who is available on site and the assisting support person in the room.
Okay. And of nursing, where do nurses fit into the primary and secondary modeling that you're doing?
I think it would depend. If a nurse primarily had, let's say, a medical surgical background, was not primarily somebody with experience working in a population with mental health conditions or a mental health setting, they're probably in the assistant monitoring role.
So they might be in the room with the person during the dosing day.
Yeah.
Okay. But then the preparation and follow-up afterwards could be done by like a psychiatric nurse practitioner.
Psychiatric nurse practitioner, a therapist, a variety of people. Yeah.
Okay. So really it is a team-based approach that you're talking about here. Okay.
And of course, psychiatric nurse practitioners could be in the role of the prescriber.
Right. Gotcha. Well, we do have a few questions here. I want to make sure we have time to get to a few of them. Let me pop this one on the screen here. Yeah, we haven't really talked about the anorexia nervosa trial that you did. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you found?
Yeah. So anorexia nervosa, of course, is another condition with big unmet needs. There are exactly zero innovative treatments available for these patients. It's one of the mental health conditions with the highest rates of morbidity and mortality. Unfortunately, it's also a condition where people living with anorexia nervosa are typically not eager to get into treatment. And so, something we found in trying to recruit for our anorexia nervosa study was that it was very difficult to recruit for. So we didn't wind up completing enrollment in that study. We ended it a little bit early. We did analyze the data. We reported that out sometime last year. There was a positive signal. There was an indication that this may be helpful in this population. We will have to evaluate as we go on, how we might, revisit trying to treat whether it's anorexia or another eating disorder. The role of COMP360 there. But again, unfortunately, it was a very difficult study to run to recruit for. Yeah,
and for the person asking a question, there are other investigator-initiated studies that are looking at this. I mean, we're running a trial at UCSF, but to your point, it has been challenging to recruit for. I mean, it's a population that often has challenges with letting go of control, and psychedelics often make that request to people that they relinquish control, at least for those few hours. There's some questions about sort of the mainstreaming of psychedelics here, which are kind of interesting, especially given the events of the last week with the executive order that came out of the White House on Saturday. Could you sort of, from a high level view, sort of talk about what you imagine that executive order is going to change? I realize I'm asking you to predict the future here, which is a very difficult thing to do in most fields, and it's a particularly hard thing to do in psychedelics. But how do you imagine that what happened on Saturday changing what Compass is doing?
I mean, first, we certainly welcomed the executive order from President Trump and his administration because unequivocally, this is good for patients, because it was a very strong statement that there's a recognition that there are millions of people suffering who don't have sufficient options today, and that we need to accelerate patient access to new options that, importantly, have sufficient data to support their safety and efficacy. And so, if you look specifically at the language of the executive order, maybe different than some of the commentary or some of the, the other discussion around it, it very clearly is focused on how do we facilitate research into psychedelics? If sufficient data has been generated, how do we speed the review time for of those products, not cut corners in terms of the standards of evidence necessary, but just the time it takes to review them, because outside of that, it can be quite a lengthy process. Again, recognizing that there are millions of people, including our service people, who are waiting for these options. I think something that has made some nervous is the interpretation that something like the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, which is this mechanism now that FDA has to speed the review of promising products, that could mean, and maybe this is what's meant by mainstreaming psychedelics, that it's going to be a free-for-all, that let's just approve all of these psychedelics regardless of the studies run. But that's not what this is speaking to, right? In the case of Compass, we've already met the bar. Essentially, we've had positive data from 2 phase 3 trials, which is what's necessary. So we've already been working with FDA on a plan for an accelerated submission of our application on a rolling basis, with them potentially reviewing it on a rolling basis. If we were to receive one of these Commissioner's National Priority Vouchers, and we don't know if we will, right, what that would mean for us is that it might trim a little bit of time off of the review period. Again, it wouldn't change the data we need to generate, and we've already generated it. But also, as part of the executive order, it asked the DEA to start their rescheduling process after phase 3 data, not having to wait for FDA approval. The typical process would be at the point of approval, they would then have 90 days to reschedule it. So this also potentially cuts 3 months off of the end of the process. But it's the same work that would need to be done, that would just be done at a different point in time. Okay. So I think that's the important take-home message here, is that the ultimate impact of this executive order isn't moving the goalpost, isn't shortchanging people on the requirements for the data necessary to have an approved product. It is shortening some of the administrative processes that are associated with the review and rescheduling of a potential new option.
So just trying to kind of grease the wheels of the otherwise slow-moving wheels of government bureaucracy. Yeah. And how does that sort of, we haven't really talked about state legalization or decriminalization or access like Colorado and Oregon. Really, it almost seems like a different path. There's a sort of a bifurcation. This is, an FDA approved treatment. This one is not. This one you can seek out on your own. This one requires a clinician. Are there other things are there other ways that sort of Compass is positioning itself with regards to these programs within states and even municipalities that have decriminalized some psychedelics?
We're really not positioning ourselves with regards to them. We are just pursuing our pathway, which is running the studies required to have an FDA-approved product so that it can be covered by payers, because that, we don't have a perfect healthcare system in our country, but that is, really the primary route to getting to people with a diagnosed mental health condition who rely upon their insurance coverage to afford access and accept care. There are these other access pathways that are happening in parallel. I think they will continue to run in parallel. As you said, they're likely for different people. And so we are just laser focused on the approach that we're taking. And, again, that's for a specific group of people that, we think will need that pathway in order to get treatment.
Yeah. I mean, it really seems like a sort of a both and scenario, because as you point out, these treatments aren't cheap. Even when they're delivered through sort of a state regulated program, they're still, the cash price for them is beyond the reach of a lot of people. Whereas a medical treatment can be hopefully paid for by commercial insurance or Medicare or the VA, which will, as you point out, widely increase access to these treatments. That's helpful. Yeah. So it's really both and. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the Oregon program, the majority of people aren't Oregonians. They're people traveling from outside of Oregon with a median income of $170,000, which is more than most.
170,000. Yeah.
170,000. And it's, obvious why. It's because it's not insurance covered. It's not medical care. It's thousands of dollars out of pocket. And so that's who can afford that.
Yeah. Yeah. I realize we're coming up to the end of our time here. There's just a couple last questions I want to ask you. One just popped up in here in the chat. Are you getting any signal at this point in terms of any factors around a patient that predict either good or not so great response? I don't know if that's something you can comment on at this point before going to the FDA, but if it is there anything that's showing up that might help us identify people that would do well, or conversely, people that should probably avoid this sort of treatment?
Not that we found so far.
Okay.
We have the patient level data from phase 2. We don't yet have that analyzed from phase 3. So at least from the phase 2 data, there weren't necessarily, characteristics of people identified ahead of time that would predict whether they were better candidates or more likely to benefit. During the experience itself, the scale that we used to measure some elements of that experience, there were some correlations between that experience, or again, elements of the experience and therapeutic outcomes, but that's not predictive ahead of time, of course. This is kind of the holy grail, of course, in psychiatry, is to have some kind of biomarker, some way to segment the population and know who's going to benefit. Ultimately, at this point, I think you'd agree with most treatments, it's down to, if something helped you once, it's likely to help you again if you need it again.
Yeah.
And we'll find out more about that with the next part of the data that we'll have in Q3 from our phase 3 studies. But otherwise, no, we haven't been able to identify that yet.
Okay. And I just want to go back and clarify something, because there's been a few comments that popped up in the discussion around qualifications for people sitting in the room with patients. Tell me if I got this wrong, but my understanding was that you were saying an RN without an advanced degree could qualify as somebody who could sit in the room as, I think you said, the assisting, the person who would be in the room for the dosing, but that because it is a prescription, it will be a prescription medicine. The person who is referring this patient needs to have the ability to prescribe that drug. They need to be able to make that order, which would be more in the realm of an advanced practice nurse who's a licensed independent practitioner, LIP, and insurance speak and all that. But did I get that correct?
You got that correct. And we would also expect either and in the REMS, or maybe even in payer policies, a requirement that there be either a prescriber available or on site in case they need to respond medically, or they need to prescribe a medicine for acute anxiety, let's say. So yes, I mean, that would probably be the primary role of an advanced practice nurse or psychiatric health nurse practitioner, is to be in that prescriber role.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
as you said, an RN level nurse, could be in the room.
Yeah. So it really is going to be a team effort. So we often wrap up these questions by asking people a little retrospective question. And so, I have a twist on this. If you could, go back to the Steve Levine of 2007, or when you were starting your ketamine clinics, or just getting interested in psychedelics, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would have advised that younger self to think about going forward?
Honestly, no. I would say to young Steve, you're on your own, sport. Well, because, I haven't made all the right decisions or all the right moves, certainly.
Yeah.
But I think it's been important that I figure it out along the way, and that I make certain mistakes or wrong decisions, or I don't know. I don't regret a single twist or turn, even though, some of them have been, again, wrong or quite painful or otherwise. So no, I've got no advice for younger Steve. He's gonna have to get through it like I did.
It's interesting how the sort of journey of psychedelics through their mainstreaming or their medicalization, or whatever you want to call it, has so many parallels to an individual psychedelic experience, and that, you kind of think you know what you're doing, and then you go in and it often is something a little unpredictable, a lot unpredictable, and, hopefully delightful, but you learn to pivot with what you sort of get pitched at you. And I think that's what we've all had to do in this, because many of the predictions I had 5 years ago have turned out to be wrong in delightful ways, and which makes me wonder, all the things that I'm trying to predict now, how will they be wrong? And they will be wrong, but will they be wrong in interesting ways? That's the question I keep thinking about.
There's a quote from a favorite book of mine, which is The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut. And I'll just make this brief. I know we're wrapping up, but
Yeah.
Well, I'll just tell the quote then, because I think we are running
Let's hear
out.
it. Yeah, no, this is a good place.
The main character at some point in the book says, "I was a victim of a series of accidents, as are we all."
Indeed. Well, Steve, this has been a delight. Really, thank you for taking the time to
Thank
come on and
you.
share what Compass is doing, and to really kind of help, especially bring some of the events of the last week into clearer focus, because there's certainly a lot happening in the psychedelic space. And so it sounds like people should really be keeping a close eye on what you guys are doing, because we should be going to the FDA before the end of the year. Is that a reasonable prediction?
We are already in a process with them of beginning a rolling submission of our NDA application.
Okay. Any idea when you might be getting a PDUFA date or anything like that?
TBD.
Okay. PDUFA is an acronym. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's basically the date where you're told that you're going to get the decision, right?
Thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, really appreciate you taking the time. We had a lot of people on tonight, and I know many people will be watching this on the rebroadcast. So appreciate you taking the time. Thanks everyone tonight for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.